Lena stood by the window, staring out at the evening sky, the fading sun casting a soft orange glow on her face. Her mind was miles away from the quiet suburban home she had built with her husband, Derek. Their life had once felt like a fairy tale, comfortable, predictable, and filled with the routine of a young couple in love. But lately, something had shifted, an undeniable tension in the air. The spark had dimmed, replaced by an unsettling emptiness that had seeped into their relationship. Her fingers gently traced the glass, her thoughts drifting back to the events of the last few months. She had tried, in vain, to ignore the pull she felt towards someone else. Someone who was not Derek. His name was Ethan. She met him at a conference in the city, a work event she had attended reluctantly, thinking it would be just another boring weekend away from home. But Ethan, with his sharp suits and confident smile, had changed all of that. There was something magnetic about him, an intensity that made her heart race every time he looked at her. They started with small talk, casual conversations over drinks, but it quickly escalated. Soon, their meetings were no longer about business. They were about something more, intimate. The first time they kissed, it had been like a jolt of electricity. It was fast and reckless, and the world around them had faded away. There had been no hesitations, no thoughts of consequences, just raw desire. Lena shook her head as if to shake off the memory. She had never planned for this, never imagined herself in this situation, but now, standing in the silence of her home, she felt a strange mix of guilt and longing. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. "I miss you. Let's meet tonight." Her heart skipped a beat. She had been seeing him more frequently, sneaking away during business trips, finding any excuse to meet. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. With Ethan, she felt alive again, as if she were rediscovering parts of herself she had long forgotten. Parts that Derek, for all his love and kindness, could no longer touch. But the guilt weighed heavily on her chest. Derek had always been a good husband. He worked hard, was loyal, and loved her in ways she often took for granted. He was the kind of man who would never hurt her, never break her trust. Yet somehow, she had broken his. Every time she kissed Ethan, every time they shared a secret glance, Lena knew she was betraying the man who had stood by her side for years. Just as she was about to reply to Ethan, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her freeze. It was Derek. He was home earlier than usual, a rarity these days. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly silenced her phone and stuffed it into her purse, her thoughts racing. What was she going to say? How could she explain the unspoken truth that lingered between them? Derek walked into the house, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice warm. He was holding a small bouquet of flowers in his hand. "I thought you might like these." Lena smiled, though it felt forced. "Thank you. That's sweet of you." He leaned in to kiss her on the cheek, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But the kiss felt different. There was a distance between them that hadn't been there before. "Long day?" she asked, trying to break the silence that had crept in. "Yeah," Derek replied, setting the flowers on the kitchen counter. "You wouldn't believe the amount of work that's been piling up. But it's nice to be home." Lena nodded, her mind still on Ethan. "Yeah, it's always nice to come home," she said, her voice betraying none of the inner conflict she was feeling. Derek was quiet for a moment, as if sensing that something was off. "Lena," he began, his tone soft but serious. "Is everything okay?" Her stomach twisted. He never asked questions like this. He was always the kind of person who took things at face value, assuming everything was fine unless told otherwise. But tonight he seemed different, more attuned to her emotions. "Of course," Lena said quickly. Too quickly. Why wouldn't it be? Derek studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. There was a flicker of suspicion, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Okay, you've seemed a little distant lately. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Lena couldn't look him in the eye. She felt a surge of shame mixed with the fear of being caught. But she couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Not now. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. The familiar name on the screen sent a shiver down her spine. Ethan, are you alone? I'm waiting. Lena's heart raced. She had to make a decision. Should she leave? Should she stay? Derek had turned away, busy with his coat and briefcase, unaware of the storm brewing within her. Lena's eyes flicked to the door, then to her phone, her hand trembling as she stared at the screen. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about her, and the choices she had to make. Choices that would either tear her marriage apart or bind her to a life she no longer felt a part of. She looked up at Derek, his back turned to her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of her love for him, a love that was now tainted by betrayal. The choice was hers, and whatever she decided, there was no going back. Lena's hand hovered over her phone, her mind a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. Ethan's message blinked on the screen, urging her with quiet intensity. Are you alone? I'm waiting. Her heart beat faster with every second, as if her body itself was urging her to answer. But she couldn't bring herself to press send. Not with Derek just a few feet away. He was there, present, unaware of the hurricane that was slowly destroying everything between them. She looked at him again, standing with his back to her, setting down his briefcase and shrugging off his jacket. His familiar movements should have been comforting, but instead, they felt like a distant echo of the man she once knew so well. Is this who you are now? She wondered. Someone who betrays the person who loves you? A sharp pang of guilt cut through her chest, but the lure of Ethan's desire, his presence that seemed to fill every empty space in her, was too powerful to ignore. She had never been one to act on impulse. She had always prided herself on being thoughtful, cautious even. But with Ethan, everything felt different. Everything felt alive. And, for the first time in months, Lena was afraid of losing that feeling. Lena! Derek's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to face him. He was looking at her now, his expression softer, but his eyes searching. Yeah, she answered, her voice betraying a hint of tension. He walked toward her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. The warmth of his touch felt strangely distant, like a reminder of how things used to be but weren't anymore. You've been acting distant lately, Derek said quietly, his voice laced with concern. I know we've been busy, but is everything okay? Lena felt a lump form in her throat. She opened her mouth, but the words caught there, as if the truth itself was too heavy to speak. I'm fine, she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. It's just work, you know? Derek nodded, though she could see the skepticism in his eyes. He wasn't buying it. He never had to ask her questions like this before. Their marriage had always been a safe haven, unspoken trust that didn't need to be questioned. But now the air between them felt thick with unspoken words. I don't know, Lena, he said, after a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. It just feels like you're slipping away from me, like there's something you're not telling me. Lena's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of reckoning. She could tell him the truth, the whole truth, or she could continue to hide, to lie, to pretend. The thought of Derek's face when he found out about Ethan was unbearable. The pain, the heartbreak, the utter devastation. She couldn't do that to him, not to the man who had been so good to her. Maybe you're just imagining things, she said, forcing a smile. It's been a lot lately. I'm just tired, that's all. Derek didn't look convinced, but he sighed and stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her in a tender embrace. Lena's body stiffened for a moment, but then she allowed herself to lean into him, feeling the warmth of his chest against her cheek. I'm lying to you, she thought bitterly, and I don't even know how to stop. His hand brushed her hair gently, and for a moment everything seemed to pause. Lena closed her eyes, letting the scent of his cologne, the sound of his steady heartbeat, ground her in the fleeting memory of their love. But the buzzing of her phone, loud and insistent, shattered the moment. Derek pulled away from her, his brow furrowing slightly, as Lena scrambled to silence the device. The guilt was suffocating now. It's just work, she muttered quickly, stuffing the phone back into her bag. She tried to keep her voice steady, but Derek's eyes narrowed. You're sure? Lena nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here with him, not while her mind was elsewhere, not when Ethan was waiting. I'm just going to grab a shower, Lena said, her voice a little too high-pitched. I'll be out in a minute. Derek didn't seem convinced, but he nodded. Okay, I'll make us dinner. As she turned to walk away, she heard him call after her softly. Lena, if something's going on, you can talk to me. You know that, right? The sincerity in his voice made her pause, her hand gripping the doorknob of the bathroom. Her heart twisted, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't think about Derek, not when Ethan's words were still fresh in her mind. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know. The bathroom door closed behind her, and Lena leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. Her mind was racing, but she had no answers, only questions. She peeled off her clothes mechanically, her mind already on the secret meeting she had planned with Ethan later, the promise of his touch, of the intensity that she had begun to crave more than she cared to admit. Lena stepped into the shower, the hot water hitting her skin like a barrage of questions, washing away the guilt for a moment, if only temporarily. She closed her eyes and let the water run over her, letting her thoughts drift. She hadn't planned any of this. She hadn't asked for the emptiness she had felt creeping into her marriage. But once Ethan had entered her life, everything had changed. He made her feel like she was someone else, someone she had forgotten existed, and in his arms, she felt seen, desired in a way Derek no longer made her feel. A sharp ring of her phone interrupted her thoughts. She stepped out of the shower, heart pounding as she reached for it. It was Ethan again. I'm here, come to me, now. Lena hesitated for a long moment. The line between right and wrong blurred in her mind. But, with a deep breath, she hit send. I'm on my way, she typed. Then, without a second thought, she began to get dressed. Her mind was made up. The affair had started, but tonight it would cross the point of no return. Lena stood in front of the mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons on her blouse. She stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman who was staring back. The woman who was on the brink of making an irreversible choice. It felt as though time had stopped for a moment, as though she were caught between two versions of herself, the wife she had been to Derek and the woman she was becoming with Ethan. Her phone buzzed again. The sound seemed almost too loud in the quiet bathroom. She glanced at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan, I'm waiting. Don't make me wait too long. Lena's fingers hovered over the keys, a heavy sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Her heart was racing now, not with excitement, but with fear. She had crossed the line before, but tonight, it felt different. This wasn't just a stolen kiss or a heated moment in a hotel room. This was an affair that was threatening to destroy everything she had with Derek. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. Ethan had become a need, an obsession. Each meeting with him had been a small act of rebellion, each touch a reminder of the life she had somehow stopped living with Derek. Her marriage, her love for Derek, had been reduced to a distant memory, something that existed in the past. She couldn't even remember when the spark between them had gone out. The guilt surged again, but it was overshadowed by a stronger, more urgent feeling, the need to escape, to feel wanted again, to feel something that wasn't the crushing weight of routine and disappointment. Bobby often said that without his health problems, he would have driven balls to the wall with joy and never had time to miss that grip. She grabbed her bag, her hand shaking as she slid her phone into it. It was too late to turn back now. She didn't know if she was doing this for herself or to feel free of something she had been holding on to for too long. But then, as she stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed once more. This time, it wasn't Ethan's message. It was a call. Derek. Lena froze. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the decline button. She should answer. She should at least hear his voice. He was waiting for her, in the kitchen, making dinner, believing everything was fine. The thought of talking to him, explaining what she was about to do, made her stomach churn. She couldn't. She knew she couldn't. The truth would shatter him, and right now she didn't have the strength to be the one to break him. With a deep breath, she declined the call and slipped her phone into her bag. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence of their home. She opened the door, stepped out into the cool night air, and locked it behind her. Her heart thudded in her chest as she walked briskly down the driveway, her mind no longer focused on Derek, but on the man she was about to meet. As she reached her car, she paused for a moment, looking back at the house. The lights in the windows cast a soft glow, and for a fleeting second, it felt like nothing had changed. Like it could all go back to normal if she just walked back inside, apologized to Derek, and tried to make things right. But the thought was quickly replaced by the image of Ethan, his smile, his hands, the way he made her feel when they were together. There was no going back. She slid into the driver's seat, started the car, and drove off into the night. The drive to Ethan's apartment felt like it took forever. The road was empty, the streets bathed in the dim light of street lamps. It was as though the world around her had fallen away, leaving only her and the pulsing need to be with him. When she finally pulled up to his building, her breath hitched in her chest. She parked the car, staring at the entrance for a moment. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, fingers white-knuckled. For a brief moment, Lena wondered what would happen next. Would this be the last time? Would Ethan tire of her just as quickly as he had consumed her? Or was she already too far gone, too caught up in the lies and the stolen moments to ever return to the life she had known? She exhaled sharply, forcing the questions out of her mind. She didn't have answers. She just had tonight. Lena walked into the building, the cool air of the lobby sending a chill through her as she pressed the button for Ethan's floor. The elevator ride seemed to stretch on forever, her heartbeat loud in her ears. By the time the doors opened, she was already committed. Ethan's apartment door was slightly ajar when she arrived, the dim glow from inside spilling into the hallway. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped inside. Ethan was there, waiting for her. "Lena," he said softly, a smile tugging at his lips as he took in her appearance. "You came." His voice was like velvet, smooth and enticing. It pulled her in, and for a moment, all the worries about Derek, about the life she was leaving behind, faded away. "I couldn't stay away," Lena whispered, her voice raw. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes darkening as he reached for her, pulling her into his arms. His lips crashed into hers, and in that moment, Lena felt every ounce of doubt and guilt melt away. It was like falling into a dream, one where nothing mattered except the heat between them, the desire that had been building for weeks. The world outside disappeared, and all that was left was Ethan and Lena, tangled in the chaos they had created together. He pushed her back gently against the wall, his hands roaming over her body with a sense of urgency. Her skin burned where his fingers touched, and she could feel the tremble of excitement racing through her. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was a moment of no return, a point where her heart, her mind, and her body were all aligned in a singular, overwhelming desire. But even in the haze of passion, something nagged at the back of Lena's mind, a small voice that whispered that she was not just betraying her husband, but herself. But for now, that voice was drowned out by the sound of Ethan's breath, his touch, and the heady intoxication of what she had chosen. Lena's mind swirled in a haze of desire and confusion as Ethan's lips moved over hers with a hunger that seemed to erase everything else. His hands were everywhere, pulling at her clothes, his fingers tracing the curve of her waist, the back of her neck, as if he couldn't get close enough. Her body responded instinctively, arching toward him, feeling the heat of his touch consume her. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the frantic rhythm of heartbeats that matched the urgency of their movements. The world outside seemed to fade into the background, the dim light from the apartment washing over them like a dream. It was impossible to think of Derek, impossible to remember the life she had left behind. In Ethan's arms, Lena was reborn, free, wanted, alive. But as his hands moved lower, the reality of what was happening hit her with a sudden, jarring clarity. A small, quiet voice in her head broke through the haze, warning her that this was a line she could never uncross. That once she took this final step, there would be no turning back. She pushed that voice away as she had so many times before. Tonight was for her. Tonight, she was not a wife, not a daughter, not a woman bound by the expectations of a life she no longer recognized. Tonight, she was just Lena, desiring, reckless, and free. Ethan's lips left hers, trailing down her neck, his breath warm against her skin. His hands were already pushing her blouse off her shoulders, the fabric sliding to the floor with ease. He was a man who knew what he wanted, and he wanted her, completely without hesitation. "Lena," he murmured, his voice low and filled with promise. "I've been waiting for this, for so long." Lena's pulse quickened at the intensity in his voice. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze, her eyes dark with longing. His stare was focused, intent on her, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. "I know," she whispered, her breath catching. "I've been waiting too." The words felt like a confession, but in the heat of the moment, they didn't seem to matter. She was here, in his arms, and everything else faded into oblivion. Ethan's hands were on her hips now, pulling her closer, his lips brushing over her collarbone as he kissed a path down her skin. Lena gasped, her mind swimming with sensations, but beneath the surface, a small voice, the one she had ignored so many times before, still lingered. It whispered that this was wrong, that she should be at home with Derek, should be the wife he deserved. But that voice, once so loud, now seemed distant, muffled by the pulse of desire that drove her forward. Ethan pulled back slightly, his fingers threading through her hair as he gazed at her with a look of raw need. "Tell me you want this," he said, his voice hoarse, his breath ragged. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say no. She wanted to stop and think, truly think, about what she was doing. But the truth was, she couldn't bring herself to stop. Not now. Not with him looking at her like this. "I want this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a confession of more than just physical desire. It was a surrender, an admission of everything she had been hiding from herself. Ethan's smile was slow and satisfied, and he kissed her again, deeper this time. His hands were all over her, exploring her body with a confidence that left Lena breathless. Every touch, every kiss seemed to strip away another layer of the life she had known. It was like stepping into a different world, one where no one knew her, no one could judge her. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself drift, caught in the sensation of Ethan's touch. But then, in the distance, she thought she heard something, a faint noise that broke through the tension in the room. It was the sound of a phone vibrating loudly in the silence. Lena's eyes snapped open, her body tensing instinctively. She knew who it was before she even glanced at the screen. It was Derek. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt the weight of the phone in her bag, an anchor to the life she had just walked away from. Ethan must have noticed her sudden stillness because he paused, lifting his head and meeting her eyes. His expression softened, as if sensing the shift in her mood. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice low but with an edge of concern. Lena hesitated. She knew she should answer, that Derek was likely trying to reach her, asking where she was, what was going on. The guilt came rushing back like a cold wave. But in that moment, all she could think about was how much easier it was to be here, away from the life she had been questioning, away from the man who, despite his love for her, could no longer make her feel the way Ethan did. "It's calling," Lena said, her voice strained as she glanced at the phone in her bag. Ethan smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Don't answer it," he said softly. "You're here now. With me." The words were tempting, seductive, and for a moment, Lena considered them. She imagined what it would feel like to ignore the call, to erase all of the obligations and responsibilities that had started to suffocate her. But then, the thought of Derek's face, his trusting eyes, the love he had shown her for so many years, flashed in her mind. It was enough to make her stomach twist in discomfort. "I have to take it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved away from Ethan, reaching for her bag on the table. The air was moving. Well, Ethan's voice was almost a growl now, a warning. He didn't like being ignored. He didn't like the reminder of the life she was still tied to. "I'm sorry," she said, her words coming out in a rush. She unlocked her phone, the screen lighting up with Derek's name. With a shaky breath, she accepted the call. "Lena?" Derek's voice crackled through the speaker. "Where are you? I've been calling." Lena's heart clenched, guilt mixing with the heat that still coursed through her veins. She glanced at Ethan, who was standing a few feet away, watching her with an unreadable expression. His eyes burned with desire, but there was something else there too. Something darker. I'm out," Lena said, her voice strained. I needed some time to think. I'm sorry. I'll be home soon." She could hear the relief in Derek's voice, but she knew he didn't suspect the truth. He didn't know where she was or what she was doing. "Okay," Derek replied, his tone softening. "Just be careful. I miss you, Lena." Lena closed her eyes, a wave of emotion flooding over her. She should have been the one to end the call, to walk away from Ethan, to go home and make things right. But instead, she hung up quickly, turning off her phone before Derek could say another word. Ethan stepped toward her, his hands resting on her hips. "You're not going back," he whispered, his voice deep and dark. Lena's eyes met his, and for a moment she wondered if she could walk away from this. But as his lips crashed into hers again, all thoughts of turning back vanished. There was no room for doubt, no space for guilt. There was only Ethan, and only now. Lena stood motionless, her body still vibrating from the intensity of the moment, her fingers lingering on the screen of her phone as the call ended. Ethan's presence behind her was almost magnetic, pulling her back into the reality she had created in this apartment. She felt like she was on the edge of something too deep to escape. She had already crossed a threshold, one where the consequences of her choices loomed large, but in the moment, all that mattered was the man who stood before her, watching her with burning eyes. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, and for a moment, all of the doubts, all of the guilt that had plagued her just moments ago, faded into the background. "You're not leaving," Ethan murmured, his voice dark and laced with possessiveness. His hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. His lips met hers again, this time more urgent, almost frantic, as if he feared she would pull away. Lena's pulse quickened as she felt the force of his kiss, the pressure of his body against hers. He was right. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She was caught in a riptide of desire, drowning in the way he made her feel like she was the only woman who mattered in the world. In Ethan's arms, there was no room for Derek, no space for the life she had built with him. There was only this, only him. Her hands moved against his chest, slipping underneath his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin. She knew what was happening, knew where this was going, but she couldn't stop herself. There was something intoxicating about it all. The danger, the secrecy, the undeniable pull between them. Ethan's hands moved lower, exploring, teasing. And for a fleeting moment, Lena's thoughts flashed back to Derek, his quiet devotion, his kindness, the way he looked at her with so much love, so much trust. But it was too late for second thoughts. It was too late for regrets. She could already feel Ethan's hands pulling at her clothes. And in that instant, the thought of stopping seemed impossible. Before she knew it, they were moving toward the bedroom, their movements frantic, as if time itself was an enemy. Ethan's lips never left hers. His hands never ceased their exploration. Lena was dizzy with the heat, her mind clouded, and as they reached the bed, all the questions she had been wrestling with, all the uncertainties, slipped away. There was only the feeling, the pulse of something wild, something forbidden. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers as he pushed her gently onto the bed, his gaze dark and full of something almost possessive. His voice was a low growl as he leaned over her. "You belong to me tonight, Lena. Only me." The words hit her like a wave. She should have resisted. She should have told him to stop. But instead, her breath caught, her body responding to the need, to the desire she had been trying so hard to suppress. She didn't fight him. She couldn't. It felt like hours, though it was only moments before Lena was consumed by him entirely, her body surrendering to the intensity of the connection. Ethan was relentless, his hands and lips exploring every inch of her as though he couldn't get enough, and she didn't stop him. She let him take control, let herself be swept away by the current of passion. In the midst of it, though, something stirred in the depths of Lena's mind. It wasn't guilt, it was something else, something darker, something that whispered she was doing exactly what she wanted to do, that this wasn't about Derek anymore. It wasn't about what she was losing, but what she was gaining. As the night unfolded, Lena was no longer the woman who had just come to Ethan's apartment to escape her life. She was something new, someone who had chosen this moment, this feeling, over the life she had known, the life that seemed to have lost its spark long ago. And yet, the nagging voice of doubt remained, even as Ethan's touch sent waves of pleasure through her. She tried to push it away, tried to focus only on him, but the truth was undeniable. Every touch, every kiss, made her feel as if she were betraying herself just as much as Derek. She wasn't just cheating on her husband, she was cheating herself, too. Hours later, when the dawn light began to creep through the window, Lena lay next to Ethan, her body still warm from the heat of their entanglement. She could hear his steady breathing beside her, feel the quiet rhythm of his chest rising and falling. But for the first time that night, a sense of emptiness settled over her, like a fog clouding her thoughts. The reality of what she had done started to creep in. She shifted slightly, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had always been someone who valued honesty, loyalty, who took pride in her relationship with Derek. How had she gotten here? How had she let herself cross this line? Her phone, now silent but still in her bag, suddenly felt like a weight. She knew that Derek was waiting for her, worrying about her. He must have been calling by now, his concern etched in every message, every missed call. And here she was, lying in another man's bed, consumed by a desire that had no place in her life. Ethan stirred beside her, his hand finding hers, his fingers interlacing with hers in a possessive gesture that sent another rush of guilt through Lena's chest. But at the same time, it felt almost comforting. This was what she had chosen. This was where she was now. She closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the turmoil, but it was like a storm, one that wouldn't pass. Ethan's kiss still lingered on her lips, his touch still burning her skin, and yet, beneath all of it, there was a truth she couldn't ignore. No matter how much she craved the passion, the freedom that Ethan gave her, she knew that sooner or later she would have to face the reality of her betrayal, the life she had left behind. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she saw the familiar name, Derek. "Lena, where are you? I'm worried. Please call me." The words hit her like a slap, a reminder of the life she was destroying. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with emotion, before slipping the phone back into her bag. She couldn't talk to him now. Not like this. Breathe now. No matter how hard it might seem, think about him, Lena, he whispered. Think about him, Lena. Think about us. Think about what we have right now. The most valuable thing that you in the world, even if you can't really see it right now. But even as his words wrapped around her, the truth was starting to sink in. No matter how much she wanted to forget, no matter how much she wanted to lose herself in this moment, the consequences were waiting for her. Derek would be waiting for her too. And eventually, she'd have to make a choice. Lena woke to the sound of the city stirring outside the window, the pale light of dawn creeping into the room, casting long shadows across the bed. Ethan was still beside her, his arm draped possessively across her waist, his breathing steady, deep. For a moment, she allowed herself to savor the warmth of his body, the feeling of being wanted, of being touched in ways that Derek hadn't touched her in far too long. But even in this moment, even with Ethan's arms around her, the weight of her actions pressed down on her chest. She could feel the coolness of the phone in her bag beneath the blanket. It was a constant reminder, a pulse of guilt that she couldn't ignore. Derek's last message was still fresh in her mind. "Lena, where are you? I'm worried. Please call me." The words echoed in her mind, cutting through the haze of desire and regret that clouded her thoughts. She knew Derek would be waiting for her, wondering where she had gone, why she hadn't come home last night. She imagined him pacing the floor, checking his phone every few minutes, his worry turning to confusion, then hurt. Her chest tightened as she pushed away from Ethan's embrace, careful not to wake him. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking as she reached for her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, the coldness of the device mirroring the icy knot in her stomach. What was she supposed to say to Derek? How could she explain where she had been, what she had done? She thought about the man she had been to Derek, the loving wife, the one who had promised to stand by him no matter what. But that woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she had left behind in the wake of her affair. Was this what she had become? A woman willing to betray everything she had built, all for the fleeting thrill of something forbidden? Was Ethan worth this destruction? As her thumb hovered over the call button, her thoughts shifted back to the man lying in the bed behind her. Ethan stirred slightly, but he didn't wake. The last night, chaotic, passionate, intense, felt like a blur now, an act of rebellion against the life she had been living. She had let go of everything just for a moment. She had given herself to him in a way that was both liberating and suffocating, all at once. But as the reality of the morning settled in, so did the knowledge that she couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep pretending that this was the life she wanted. The emptiness that had first driven her into Ethan's arms was still there, lurking beneath the surface. It hadn't disappeared with a few stolen kisses and moments of passion. It was deeper than that, more complicated. She looked at Ethan again, his dark hair tousled, his lips slightly parted as he slept. There was no doubt in her mind that he had the power to make her forget, to make her lose herself in him. But what would it cost her? What would be left when the excitement wore off, when the affair was over and the truth finally came crashing down? The sound of her phone vibrating again broke her thoughts. This time, it wasn't Derek's name flashing on the screen. It was a message. She opened it hesitantly. "I'll be home soon. Please talk to me." It was from Derek, sent not long after the last call. She could feel the rawness in those words, the vulnerability, the plea for some kind of reassurance, some sign that everything was still okay. Tears welled in Lena's eyes. She blinked them away, trying to swallow the ache that had suddenly constricted her throat. She had betrayed him. She had betrayed herself. She couldn't keep running from that truth. In the stillness of the morning, the decision was clear, though it felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. She had made her choice when she walked out the door last night. But now, standing at the crossroads of her own heart, she knew she had to find the courage to face the consequences. She turned toward Ethan, watching him sleep for a moment, his face relaxed in the innocence of slumber. She felt a pang of something, regret, perhaps, but also a strange sadness. As much as she had let him in, as much as she had let herself be consumed by him, she knew that he wasn't the answer. He was an escape, a temporary balm for a wound that could never be healed by another man's touch. The wound of a life lost, a marriage that had quietly withered under the weight of neglect. Lena stood, her legs unsteady beneath her as she gathered her things. Ethan stirred as she moved around the room, but she didn't look at him. She didn't need to see his confusion or disappointment. She needed to face the man who had every right to be angry, to be hurt. The man who had trusted her, loved her, and still believed in their future. She slipped out of the room quietly, taking one last look at the apartment that had, for a fleeting moment, felt like freedom. She left the door slightly ajar behind her, and in that space between two worlds, the weight of her actions felt unbearable. The drive home felt endless. The morning light, once beautiful and soft, now seemed oppressive, as if the world itself was bearing down on her, Her hands were tight on the steering wheel, her stomach twisted with anticipation of what was to come. She parked in the driveway, staring at the house. The familiar brick walls, the well-tended garden, the cozy front porch where Derek had once kissed her goodbye on mornings they both hurried out the door. It felt so different now. It felt like a place she had lost. The door was still locked when she entered. The smell of coffee and something baking filled the air. Derek's usual Saturday morning routine. He was in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot, humming softly to himself. It was the most ordinary scene, yet it felt worlds apart from the turmoil that raged within her. When he saw her, his face lit up with relief. "Lena!" he said, his voice warm. He walked toward her, as though nothing was wrong, as though the world hadn't shifted beneath their feet. But it had, and she couldn't lie anymore. I'm sorry," she said, before he could say anything else. The words came out in a rush, but they felt right, like a confession long overdue. I don't know how to explain this, but last night I wasn't here. I was with someone else." Derek froze, his hands stilling over the pot. His eyes widened in disbelief, his face pale. "What?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air with the sharpness of 1,000 shards of glass. I cheated on you, Derek," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. I've been lost for so long, and I don't know how to fix it. I'm so sorry." The silence between them was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. She could feel Derek's shock, his hurt, his confusion. He stared at her, his face unreadable, and then, without a word, he walked past her, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him how sorry she was, how deeply she regretted everything, but something told her that the man she had been, the woman she had chosen last night, no longer had a place here. And as Derek's silence filled the room, Lena realized that the affair was over, not because of the love she still had for Derek, but because the truth had finally caught up with her. There was no going back.